Hello. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brian Johnston. I work over in athletics, but today I'm going to talk to you guys about single subject design. And as we go through, we'll kind of go through some basic things here today, make sure everybody's kind of got a good background. And then when we get in the classroom, we're going to do some examples. We're going to work through some problems and do a little bit more of the applied things so that you can use some of these tools that you'll learn today and next class to maybe help with some research that you're interested in. So first of all, what is single subject research? Well, it's a research method that offers an alternative to group designs, because sometimes when you're dealing with group designs, you run into issues getting enough people to be in your study, people showing up on time, that kind of thing. And then one good thing about single subject is you just have to manage one individual. Sometimes it's called a time series. Basically, you're examining something over a period of time. Oftentimes this occurs over weeks, months, maybe even a year if you wanted to go that far. Sometimes it's also called a N of one. Basically, your total subject number is one. It is within subject research. So you're basically doing research on something that happens within that one individual. You have an experimental examination of an intervention on an individual. So basically, instead of having to have a control group and withhold that research intervention from that group, now you're just using the individual as the control. So whatever their normal status is, what their baseline is, and we're going to talk a lot about baseline with the individual here. It's often used in clinical settings, and probably every example that you'll run into initially is something to do from a clinical standpoint, whether it's we'll go through some very specific examples, but clinically, especially in psychology, there's a lot of single subject research out there. One thing it is just not a case study, and it's very familiar to a case study, and they're very similar. But it would be wrong for me to tell you that they are the same, because they do have some very distinct differences. So when we look at what the difference is between a case study and single subject design, case studies are very descriptive, and for that matter, single subject design is as well. It's a study of an individual. Data collected is detailed, qualitative, very anecdotal. You're basically taking a history, just like you were taking a history of someone in a medical office. Very strong focus on the unique aspects. So most of your case studies are done on individuals who've had something that's very different, very unique. No one wants to read a case study on someone with an ankle sprain. Everyone wants to read a case study on someone with an ankle sprain with an open fracture. People are interested in that. Data is typically retrospective, so pretty much your case studies are always done after the fact. So we are looking at a case that was done, and this is how it was handled, and this is the end. And when we do that, there's no experiment to it. I mean, it's pretty much this happened, this is the result, and this is what we feel about that result. Now, in single subject design, there is a true experiment. It is experimental. There's an intervention that's introduced, okay, and we're going to basically examine or analyze the effect of that intervention on the control, okay? From a measurement standpoint, and you're going to hear me mention this many times, and that is repeated measures. The outcome variable is measured repeatedly. We get a lot of repeat information to make sure that we're ruling out any other kind of error. Now, compared to group research, okay, group designs, the researcher may miss an individual experience with an intervention. So you think about athletics and you think about sports science, and in that field, you may apply an intervention to a group, and overall the group responds very well. However, what happens if your best athlete doesn't respond at all? Well, is it worth it? Is it worth bringing your average, mediocre athletes up so that the elite don't move at all? Is it a worthwhile thing? And so you really have to look at the intervention, and especially if you're dealing with small teams, if you're dealing with tennis, really soccer for that matter, is the intervention that you're introducing affecting everyone the same? Individuals are going to respond differently. Group averages, again, they're going to miss that individual interaction. And as the number of subjects increase, the individuality of the responses decreases. And so the more people that you get involved, if you're doing this with a football team, if you're doing this with a large soccer team, if you're doing this with potentially a swim team, you're really going to have trouble, because as the population increases, a lot of that individuality goes down at the same rate. Now, from a historical standpoint, let's look at kind of your major things that you're going to read about. Paul Broca. okay? 1861, he only used one brain. And yet we know, and in an anatomy class over at the med school here, we talk about the work by Paul Broca, and we don't even mention the fact that he took one brain, figured it out, and then that's what we've used to map out everybody else's situation. And then we relied solely on that situation. Fechner, he came out with a just notable distance where basically he had one person who could tell the difference between 2 points with pressure, but it was just one person. He didn't do this big, elaborate, huge study. One person. Pavlov, you remember the bell, and people make reference to Pavlov's dog all the time, and you may even hear them say Pavlov's dogs, which is really incorrect because he only used one dog. He used one dog. He provided the intervention. He gained a response. Everybody, quotes that, repeats that, uses that incorrectly by saying Pavlov's dogs because there was only one. Now, B.F. Skinner is kind of the guy when it comes to single subject design, and you'll hear his name, you'll read articles, he will be referenced. He may be the author of articles. Dr. Sands was big in talking about this. When I had this class a few years ago, he made the statement, a large N is not necessary. There is a statistical comparison of means. You don't have to do that. Okay, single subject provides valid and replicable results. And then repeated measures in baseline and intervention are all necessary in well-controlled conditions. Now, all of these things seem like, well, now they might be common sense, but Skinner went out on the limb here back in the day, and he's kind of fought that fight, and people have kind of stood by him. And single subject design, really takes a hit. Even my dissertation topic here, our IRB office declared it non-research because it was only one individual. So for those of you thinking about what you're going to do your dissertation on, and if you don't want to deal with the IRB, that's one way to go. Now, some basic components. All single subject designs, the subject is the control. And we've mentioned that previously. Well, you're going to mention it over and over again. So basically the control, or what we are going to use to base all of our intervention results on, is the subject. Dependent variables are basically measured repeatedly. The hallmark of single subject design is repeated measures, repeated measures, repeated measures. They should have stable baseline. Originally I had the word must in there, but there are times when you could account for that. We'll look at the tau U when we get into class, and there is actually a statistical program within that website that you can control for an unstable baseline. The experimental control, is achieved through introduction, withdrawal, reversals, staggered introduction. Basically, we're doing all kinds of things to that independent variable. We're basically taking the control and we're basically attacking the control to look for a response. Pretty much your base visual analysis, or your base analysis of single subject design, is all visual. You're going to interpret the level, the trend, any variability in the data that you see. Most of your single subject design, you're going to look and you can see with your eyes that there's been some kind of interaction, there's been some kind of change. Now, the key is being able to justify that interaction that you see with your eyes statistically. External validity is accomplished through replication of effects, and so we're able to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and see the same things and then statistically derive the same information so that we can eliminate that. And then there's some social validity by documenting that interventions are functionally related to change and social important outcomes. One of the things that you'll run into trouble with single subject designs is you cannot generalize it to the population or all populations. And again, you think about the early work by Broca and by Pavlov. Well, they did it and it worked. You have to be very careful how you do that. And again, my experience, it was very difficult to apply what I found with this individual to everyone because he had such unique physical attributes in his baseline. Now, the critical components, again, most essential component is repeated measures. And the repeated measures in the baseline and repeated measures in the intervention are so critical. You cannot have enough data points. As Dr. Sands would say, repeated measures are the hallmark of single subject design, and I will mention that over and over and over again. Through continuous assessment, you're going to get that. You've got to have at least 5. I've got on here should have 3 or 5. I'm telling you, you need to have 5 data points in each of one of these phases at a minimum. To be able to do that maintains that baseline stability and allows you to actually get a good comparison. When you look at your baseline assessment, before you apply that intervention, you should always look and say, what do I think is going to happen? From a stability standpoint, why is there not stability? Why is there not stability in the baseline? Is there some kind of external influence? Is there some kind of environmental intervention that I'm not noticing? Is it with individuals, you never know. I mean, the mood itself could change from day to day. Now, your typical components of single subject design, you always want to identify the behavior. So you specify the problem. And this is not the easiest thing in the world. Oftentimes you come up with the problem and it changes, because as you're working through how you're going to identify this problem and how you're going to apply an intervention, it turns out that maybe that's not really the problem that I was interested in. You kind of have to scrape away all the fluff. And we love, human nature loves to try to solve big problems, and we want to cure cancer and win a Nobel Prize, when sometimes we just need to back down and take things very, very, very simple and move forward. Once we identify the problem, we have to select the design. And once we select the design, we have to make sure that it's going to measure the problem that we're going to research. Because oftentimes we come up with our design and then we go backwards and try to figure out what the problem is. And when you do that, sometimes it doesn't always work out. But once we figure it out and we know what our problem is and we know how we want to measure it, or we want to design the study, then we have to measure the problem. And when we do, again, it's repeated measures. It's data points. You've got to get them. You get that stable baseline through data collection, and then you repeat your intervention, and get as much data as you possibly can. And once you get that data, you have to analyze the data, and then basically you make your consensus based on the results of your analysis. Now, when we think about measurement, because this is kind of where we really want to end up, right? There's 4 methods of measurement. So we can measure the frequency, basically counting the number of times an event occurs, the duration, basically the length of the time that an event lasts, the interval with the length of time between events, or the magnitude, which is the intensity of the event. We're going to basically display all this graphically so you can visually look and see what's going on. We typically use the x-axis as the time and the y-axis as the score. So it's basically a long run chart. You've done run charts and flow charts. As that run chart runs, it may run for weeks, months, days, years. It's going to run for a long time. And then your data points will kind of fill in along that graph, and you're able to actually see what's going on over a month, over 2 months. So that you can get a good visual idea of what's actually happening. Now, there are different types of single subject design. You have your basic A-B design, where you have your baseline and an intervention. You have your reversal or your withdrawal, where you have your baseline, you have your intervention, then you withdraw the intervention and you return to baseline. And you can have some multiple baselines that we'll talk about, or multiple treatment. Now, when we do these, we do need to address internal and external validity. And I've kind of mentioned them a little bit, but internal validity is the extent to which other variables could produce an effect. So basically, are there other things that could produce this effect other than the intervention? This is addressed through your withdrawal or your reversal designs. And so essentially, if you can apply an intervention, take it away, everything returns back to your normal baseline, then obviously what that intervention did produced the effect. Now, externally is basically how the results of the experiment can be generalized. And this is where you can get into trouble, or it can get a little tricky. Can the results be applied to everyone? Can they be applied to anyone? This also can be addressed through replication. So you reproduce the same study over and over again, and you're going to get similar results. Again, if you have an individual who is, if you're dealing with knee range of motion and this person starts at 6 to 8 degrees of hyperextension, you can't say that person is normal. Okay, so you have to be very careful there. Now let's talk about your basic A-B design. Basically, your A is the baseline and your B is your treatment or intervention. Now, effectiveness of that intervention is tested by evaluating the presence and degree of change in the dependent variable. So basically, you get a visual display. You get a change in the slope, the trend of that line. And so from a baseline rule standpoint, you need to have about 5 data points. There should be some stability noted. The trend doesn't have to be flat. That baseline doesn't have to be flat, but it needs to be consistent. And if the baseline is unstable, you have to make sure that you're measuring the right thing, measuring the correct behavior. check the definition of your target behavior. Check the definition of your problem statement. Because if your problem statement has flaws, you may not be measuring the correct thing. Now, it's an easy example of someone doing math problems, and without music, they're getting about 3. You can see they've got 5 data points there where they got 3 right every time. We added music, and all of a sudden they started improving. So if we were going to look at this, we'd say, was there a change? Well, visually, absolutely there was a change. From the baseline where the individual only got 3 problems correct to the music where they got more problems. I mean, at one point they even got 9. That's a big difference. Now, I can say that. We can all see that. But statistically, can I say that this was a significant difference? Well, right now I can't. Visually, I can say yes, I can. Now, by the end of this lecture and when we get into the classroom, you're going to be able to determine how to do that, and it's not going to be that difficult. Now, your withdrawals are your ABAB. So basically, you give your baseline, your intervention, your return to baseline, or your withdrawal, maybe another intervention. So this could go on to an AB, 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 and you can continue to repeat that over and over again to see what happens. If the baseline returns to normal, something happened. The return to normal rules out threats to internal validity. Okay? Now, here's a good example. So here's our music question. So we got 3 questions right in our baseline, no music. We added music, and that's their second B. Once we added music, we got some correct. We took the music away, and you can see that eventually we returned back to baseline. And so here, you can see we return back on points 22, 23, and 24. We're back to our normal baseline. Then we added the music again, and when we did, you can see here we got better again. And so was there a difference? Was there a change? Was there an interaction there? Yes, there was. Visually, we can say absolutely there was a difference there. And so as we move through some statistics and some data analysis techniques, we can go back to these graphs and we can say, yeah, they did because this was the effect size, or this was, or R value, or however we want to do that. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Now, if we want to deal with multiple baselines, okay, we don't have to necessarily remove the intervention. Okay, the effect is seen only when an intervention is applied to the behavior. So basically, it's a summation of effects. And so we have a baseline, then we have an effect, then we have a new baseline, and then when we apply the intervention, we improve again or decrease again. It doesn't have to always be getting better. It could be getting worse. Okay. There was a food options in 4-year-olds, and basically they started with no options, gradually increased in a stepwise manner over time. If you look up the research by Knock 2002, you'll kind of see that the kid would he had no options, so he didn't eat a whole lot. Then they introduced 3 options, and so he ate a little bit of food. And then they introduced 4 or 5 options, and he ate a little bit more food. And then by the end of the study, when he went from not eating any types of food at all to really expanding his palate, and he was able to actually eat a more normal diet. And so, again, these are more psychological issues, and so this was done with kids. Obviously, this is a 4-year-old who would not eat at all. And so, you as you read through this study, it's pretty interesting to kind of see how they put this together. But this is a great example of how a summation of baselines. And so basically, you're going to have your baseline, your intervention, your new baseline intervention, but you can't compare the 2 baselines together. You can't compare the intervention levels. You can only compare it to the previous baseline. Now, when you have multiple baselines, basically you implement this across behaviors, across participants, and across settings. So essentially, you can do a simple. Multiple people can be doing single subject design, the same single subject design, and you can kind of compare across the board. On the 4th intervention, you can look at all of them and see how that resulted. Some problems with multiple baselines, though, is sometimes change can occur without intervention, and sometimes there can be some internal validity issues. From time to time, the behavior changes without an intervention, and when that happens, you have to wonder what is going on. Your multiple treatment designs. So the intensity of an intervention is going to change over time. Each change is going to have a new phase associated with it. And again, the biggest limitation is you can only compare it to the most adjacent phase. So your multiple treatment designs, again, usually it's associated with some kind of reward where basically, okay, if you do this, you're going to get this reward. And if you do this, you get this other reward, and back and forth. And so the intent or the lure for them to do well is to get the reward. Now let's talk a little bit about data analysis, because this is kind of where the rubber meets the road for you guys, and that is looking at visual display of information. So we've mentioned it before, your trend, slope, and level is kind of your first line of defense, because visually you're going to look at this research, the research results, and when you graph your data, and you're going to know right off the bat, based on the trend of the slope and what the level is, you're going to know either something happened or it didn't. Are there changes in the data patterns? If there are, that's good. Well, how do you know it? Well, you got to prove it. Okay. Now the power of the study is determined by replication of treatment effectiveness, and so if we can, repeat this over and over again with different individual subjects, then that makes the power of the subject, more well received in the scientific community. Now your visual display data analysis, you have difference in level, change in trend, and change in variability. Difference in level or change in means, basically use the mean of each phase and compare. So basically it's the difference between the baseline mean and the intervention mean. We'll do some examples of this in class. The level of performance, basically the difference between the last data point and the first intervention data point. So our baseline, our last point in the baseline, and our first data point in the intervention, that's going to give us a difference. And so as we look and compare from baseline to first intervention, we get an idea of, has there been a change? There's a trend in performance. Okay, this focuses on all of your consistent, systematic increases, could be decreases in their intervention performance. Also called the split middle, and we're going to do some split middle, and we'll talk about ECL, which is accelerated lines there. The average of the first half of the intervention points, average of the second half of the intervention points, and we're going to connect those, and we're going to look at that slope, and then we're going to look at the slope of the line for the baseline, and we're going to see, does it go up, does it go down, is it unchanged? And so whenever we look at that on the intervention side, if there's an up, then we have an ascending phase, descending, or it remains unchanged. Okay, that's pretty easy. The Nugent method here, you kind of see on the left, you've got your baseline, and we can see right from the last to the first data point, you can kind of see that there is the way that slope of that line is, and you look at the intervention, and the intervention took all of the improvement out of that. So was there a change? Well, absolutely there was a change. Is it what you might expect? Is it what you're used to seeing? No, not at all. Now trend. Okay, trend, you basically compare the direction of the behavior pre and post. So it's an increase in occurrence, decrease in occurrence, no change. That's kind of what we just saw. Now the slope, basically it tells you what the strength of the trend is. Okay, the steeper the slope, the greater the change in the behavior. So basically the quicker that we're able to alter whatever that normal slope or that normal flow is, that's going to tell us that there was more of an interaction. And then the level, basically that establishes the significance of the change. So your criteria for evaluating single subject designs. Number one is the data reliable, and that goes to stability. Is this something that's, if I were to come back and repeat this study, I'm going to get similar results? Was the behavior altered with the intervention? Okay, the level, basically, what did something happen? Was the change observed significant? Well, again, if we look at the slope, if we have this steep slope, we know there was some kind of change there. Are the results generalizable to other individuals? And again, that's going to be tough. That's going to be dependent upon the uniqueness of your subject. Was the baseline stable? Well, we can look at some trend and we can kind of tell what's going on there. And was the variability within phases? So when there is variability between phases, then something probably happened. We don't like to have variability in our baseline, though. We like to have it nice and stable. Now, some advantages and disadvantages of single subject design. The good parts, it's very, very detailed. Easy to control. You only have one person. In group designs, you run into some ethical concerns of withholding an effective a treatment that you deem to be effective, because what if it's a medication that's going to allow them to extend their life, and you need a control group, and basically they're all going to die next week, and the other group's going to live for 2 more years. So, I know that's kind of an extreme case, but there's a lot of people that have a hard time with that. Sometimes it's hard to recruit a large group of subjects who all fit into the exclusion categories that you need. it can open the door to bigger research without a doubt, and you can be a lot more flexible in what you're doing. When we think about coaching, especially elite athletes, evidence-based, again, you're dealing with really elite athletes. Any changes that are going to be seen are going to be very, very small, and the bigger the group in your study, you're going to wash some of that away. Now, some of the negatives, it's very hard to generalize, and it's hard, again, to compare the elite athlete to the general population. And, you know, an unreliable subject can destroy your entire research program. I mean, I'll be honest with you, with my research in my dissertation, I was going to pick my subject up and bring him to treatment to record this data as much as I possibly could. I brought him to the test site. So if you have an unreliable or an untrustworthy subject, you know, you've got to do what you can to get them going. Now, there's multiple ways to determine effect size. Now, we can use percentage of non-overlapping data, and we'll talk about that, PAND. We'll use a lot of that. There's 2 or 3 different options there. There's a standard mean difference, and that's fairly easy. The split middle and the percentage reduction, we'll go over those examples. And then I want to show you the website for the TAU. Now, on D2L, you're going to have a link to the TAU website, and it's at Texas A&M, and there's a nice video that shows you what it's for, how to use it. We're going to go over it in class. We'll come up with we'll make up some data and a study, and we'll go through, and I want to show you how you can use that because the TAU website is really good. I mean, the information that it spits out is really good. It's a lot more user-friendly than you might imagine. And there's a lot of other ways that we can go about getting effect size here. So this is not an all-inclusive list. There's lots of other opportunities. So kind of what your goal is, or what your assignment is, if you had one, is to review those articles that are attached to D2L. Some of you, these are going to come in handy. You're going to want to reference these back and forth. Watch the video on the TAU. It's not long, it's short. And then bring questions to class. We'll work through some actual visual and statistical analysis pieces and kind of look at it. We got 2 days to kind of play with this stuff and make sure that everybody's very comfortable. And so if you have any questions, please, again, jot them down, and we'll go through it and try to address those. I by no means am an expert in single subject design, but that is the path that I chose from a dissertation standpoint, and so I can tell you what I did right, what I did wrong. If any of you are interested in doing some things, we can talk about it. You know, I've got 2 or 3 things going on right now. So I wish all of you well, and I look forward to seeing you over in the classroom.